Greetings. It's my privilege as Provost of Baylor University to join the others on our program in welcoming you to this virtual conversation on the importance of civility and civil discourse in our society and on our college campuses. The Baylor in Washington program is pleased to be co-sponsoring this event with the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America as a program of the Joint Initiative on Faith and the American Commonwealth. The question our panelists will answer this afternoon is, does civility still matter? And I have to say, at Baylor University, our answer is an unequivocal yes. As a Christian research university, we place a high priority on cultivating civility and compassion across our campus and on developing the arts of civil discourse in our classrooms and social gatherings. Today, the need to champion the importance of compassion and civil discourse has never been greater. We live in a world in which it seems people struggle to get along with one another. Everyone has a hot take on current issues. The opinions are at polar extremes and compromise is nearly non-existent. However, Scripture advises us to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. We are also, as Christians, called to encourage one another and build each other up. Our Christian faith compels us to see the image of our Creator in the faces of everyone we meet and interact with, whether or not we agree on a particular issue. In fact, it is in disagreement that we have the greatest opportunity to demonstrate the value of civility, to show that engaging in vigorous yet civil discussion with one another is the path to greater understanding and shared solutions. Personal interactions, seeking dialogue, and truly listening to one another are what feed the heart and build community within a Christian environment. Being exposed to differing views and attempting to learn from one another face to face leads to our own growth as individuals and an academic institution. At Baylor, we place great value on an environment in which faculty members can freely express their views. In tandem with that commitment is our equally strong dedication to fostering a social community in which civil discourse and mutual respect are expected and encouraged. And that balancing act to protect these two principles, freedom and respect, can be challenging at times. However, we believe that all truth is God's truth, fully open to inquiry and debate, and thus the cause of preserving free speech within the responsibilities of civil discourse is well worth the effort. Like you, I look forward to learning from the insights and perspectives of our distinguished panelists for today's events. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Provost Brickhouse. I appreciate your taking time to do the introduction. And I thank Baylor University for supporting this. I also want to thank the Institute for Human Ecology at Catholic University of America for being our co-partners. Let me ask our panelists to come on now. I've asked my assistant, Nate, to put in the chat for all audience members who want to see it, a link to the full bios of our panelists. But I don't want to spend a lot of time on the introductions because I know our panelists are very well known. I'm here with Andrew Sullivan, who maybe not everybody knows is actually Dr. Sullivan. He did his PhD in the government department at Harvard. He's a longtime writer of 6 books and a prolific blogger, probably best known for his own blog, The Daily Dish. I'm also here with Teresa Bejan, who is a PhD from Yale and is a professor of political theory at Oriel College in Oxford, and also the author of Mere Civility, which is directly relevant to the topic at hand. And of course, the indomitable Dr. Cornel West, who did his PhD at Princeton and has been a long-time beloved professor at places like Harvard and Princeton and Union Theological Seminary and even the University of Paris. And he's always such a joy to have with us. So thank you, panelists, for joining us. We're thrilled to have you with us. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation about civility at a time when civility seems to be in some disrepair, but we'll see if you all think that too. That's part of the motivation for the panel. I'm going to direct the conversation, but I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts. And I thought I would just get started by pitching a question over to Teresa, because I think it might be useful to start with some definitional spade work, actually, because civility, though it's a pretty common term, I think is sometimes misunderstood. And in particular, I think it's often equated with niceness or something like politeness or something even like respectfulness, all of which seem, to me at least, to differ a bit from civility. I myself link civility to the Latin word for city, and it seems to me something more along the lines of an ability to live together with other people in a city. But Teresa, would you help us understand sort of the definitional lay of the land and some of the common mistakes that people sometimes make with respect to civility?
Yeah, absolutely. Nothing gives me more joy than being a pedant about civility and civility talk. I think you're right that for all the sort of gnashing of teeth and clutching of pearls about civility in American public discourse, we're not very good at being sort of precise about what it is we're talking about. I think that it's important to distinguish civility as a conversational virtue from other conversational virtues, like the ones you mentioned: politeness, respect, decorum. Civility is peculiar in that it seems to be relevant to disagreement in particular. And it's relevant to disagreements between people who stand in a particular relation to one another. So again, the idea that those who share a civitas, which, you know, it could be a city, it could be a state, they are expected by virtue of their membership to engage civilly when they disagree. Now, that's kind of what I would define civility, the virtue, as. But when we talk about civility today, I think it's really doing something else. So what I call civility talk is the kind of, you know, worrying about a lack of civility, or mainly accusing others of incivility. And I think that accusing others of incivility happens itself to be an extremely uncivil thing to do, because it's a way, again, of shutting down a disagreement as opposed to conducting it civilly. But I'm sure we're going to talk more about that. But yeah, I think it's really important for us to be precise here today. Oh, David, you're muted.
Thank you for that. That's great. That gives us a great sense, for starters, of what civility is. It's in a way, I think, more demanding than mere niceness, because often you're dealing with people you don't like, and yet required to talk to face in a way that sort of airs differences but doesn't prevent you from living together as fellow citizens. Andrew, if I may, why is civility necessary? What does it make possible that would not be possible otherwise?
I think it makes possible our capacity to engage the issues as opposed to ourselves. As soon as you project bad motives, for example, to your opponent, or accuse them of lying, or accuse them of not having a place in this discussion because of some aspect of their identity, then you're in trouble in terms of actually being able, as a civil society, to grapple with difficult questions, to hash them out as openly as one can. And that prevents us from correcting our mistakes. It prevents us from seeking the truth, because I'm a big believer in the Socratic method. The more you talk things through and debate, the more likely you are to come to some kind of truthful conclusion. I agree with you too that niceness isn't part of it. I think if you think of the British House of Commons, say, I was brought up in the Oxford Union, which models that. It's interesting. It makes both sides look at each other right in the face. It's divided into two. And certain things are not allowed to be said. On the one hand, you can say anything about a public issue. You can violate all sorts of privacy laws. You can't commit libel in Parliament, but you cannot accuse one of your opponents of lying deliberately. And that's an interesting, and when you think of the House of Commons, you've probably seen pictures of it, it's a very noisy, rowdy, ugly place. People are yelling, screaming, banging their desks, doing this whoa, 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 whoa stuff. But it's civil because the rules are in place. There is a speaker to enforce them. And goodness knows debate is very frank and open, but it doesn't degenerate into ad hominems. And I think that's the key, not personalizing this stuff.
Cornel, do you have any thoughts on this same question of what civility makes possible, what it enables that wouldn't be possible without civility?
Without civility. But I first want to thank Brother Dave. I want to thank Sister Molly and Brother Nate for bringing us together. They have been magnificent, magnificent. And we salute, of course, our dear sister Brickhouse, the provost. And it's always a blessing to be with Brother Dave, indeed. And when you said Brother Andrew was coming and Sister Teresa's coming, I said, we're going to have a good time today in Baylor. They may have won the championship. That's a beautiful thing. But other things going on at Baylor too. And these are crucial issues. But, I look at it this way, that I think of the line in the great Walt Whitman's Democratic Vistas when he talks about how do we create conditions in which people can enter public space without humiliation and be able to be themselves. I see, that's the conception of integrity. Integrity. And we just had a wonderful salute to Louis Armstrong last night. And I'm thinking about this. What does it mean to be fully yourself and to bring all of who you are into a public space? So that, of course, you're going to agree. Of course, you're going to disagree. Of course, you're going to contend. Of course, you're going to clash. But you feel as if you can do that in such a way that you can be transformed and you can transform others. You see, that's a thick conception of democratic praxis at both an existential and a political sense. Civility, to me, if it moves in that direction, that's wonderful. Now, you all recall that wonderful book by John Murray Cudahy, who was my very dear brother. He wrote a book called The Ordeal of Civility. And he said in the modern world, civility's become so thinned out, it's really wearing a mask. It's really just a kind of manipulative sense of external manners. So integrity is not external manners at all. Not at all. And so the difficulty of, for example, all of us being able just to be ourselves with all of our inconsistencies, all of our incongruities, but also radically disagree. I mean, me and Brother Andrew been going at it for 30 years. That's cool. Me and Sister Teresa and, Abe Vogelin and Leo Strauss context, we learning from each other. Same is true with Brother Dave. So that, to me, is what we're after. That's the regulative ideal, as it were.
That's super helpful. What makes me wonder, though, and this will be the most academic of the questions, and I apologize for that, but I do have three trained philosophers in front of me. Is humility, how exclusively is it aligned with liberal democratic regimes, or how universal is it? And I'm just going to let anyone who has a sense of that.
So are you asking how aligned humility is, or how aligned civility is?
If I said humility, I'm sorry, I meant to say civility. Yeah, is civility, we know it thrives in liberal democratic regimes, and they in turn depend on it. But is it a wider phenomenon than that?
So, speaking for myself, I think it's really important, again, to make some distinctions. So I would say that civility, as this conversational virtue that makes kind of unmurderous, if you will, coexistence possible in a society, is going to look really different in different places. So there's something like civility. There is a virtue of civility that arises in all sorts of different regimes, historical contexts, etc. But I think that the kind of civility we're interested in today, and my fellow panelists are rather attached to, I think, is one that's distinctively crucial in a particular kind of society. So everyone's been talking thus far about civil societies. I would actually add to that. I say the civility we're interested in is the one that's relevant to tolerant societies. And I would understand a tolerant society as one that's committed not only to accommodating difference or diversity, but also to disagreements about that difference, right? So it's not, civility is trying to do two things. It's trying to make tolerable not only our differences, but the really sort of heated and sometimes even hateful disagreements that those differences can inspire. And that's why it seems like such a fraught business, and why it very quickly gets pretty controversial.
Yeah. with respect to the controversy, I'm going to ask about the limits of civility in just a second. But before I do, I want to just point out what so many people are already aware of. For some people, civility is not really a virtue. In fact, it's disguised power. Mm. And Teresa, I have in mind the distinctions you laid down right at the beginning. And so maybe it is that they misunderstand civility and mistaking it for civility talk. But Andrew, in particular, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about these accusations that civility is actually a kind of a tool by the ruling class to oppress people who are agitating for social change.
Well, yes, that is currently a very powerful critique rooted in a very different epistemology, rooted in values that are actually hostile to liberal democracy, that don't believe in liberal democracy, believe it itself is a sham, is a mask for a brutal oppression, and that asking people to commit to being equals in a conversation, regardless of their background, race, gender, all the other things that we can attribute to people is, I think, essential to liberal democracy. But it is obviously now under really intense assault. And it's interesting to know why that has happened. I think it's happened partly because, in fact, the anti-liberal position of critical theory has entered and become the dominant mode of thought among people on the center, left, and left in such a way that it becomes oppressive. The argument is that it's oppressive for two people to treat themselves as equal in a liberal civil conversation when one, for example, is a male or one is a female. That because of the essential power dynamics of that situation, that they are not equal, will never be equal. And also it means that some things that people can say are not admissible because of their identity, or must be silent or prioritized in favor of other people who are deemed by virtue of their identity to be marginalized and oppressed. Now, this is an argument you could talk about and read about. The only thing I think that's salient about it is that it is absolutely opposed to civility. It's opposed to free discourse. It's opposed to the concept of two people in a thin conception of democracy being able to enter into a debate just as avatars of a particular point of view. And that I find deeply depressing. I'm not quite sure why it's happened. One is the growth of this philosophy and its popularity and the way it's being taught across the entire academy. The other is the internet, I think, which has liberated people, if that's the right word, from having this kind of conversation in which we look at each other's eyes, face to face, as human beings, and inevitably temper the way we speak differently than we do if we were wearing masks, or if we're invisible, or if we're anonymous trolling on the internet. And so the incivility has also sprung up with extraordinary vigor online, and one only has to go to Twitter to see it. I would say that maybe over 90% of the responses to any points I make are entirely ad hominem. They dismiss you because you're white, because you're male, because you're gay, because whatever. And they always aspire the worst, project the worst motives onto you. So you can't just be mistaken, but you are malevolent and deliberately trying to lie. And that is increasingly the tenor and tone. So those are the things, this new illiberal philosophy that is dominating our elites, and the rise of the internet, which makes accountability and the human interaction of two people worthwhile.
I want to call on Cornel in a second, but one of the things you said that seems so important is that our regime is founded on a sense of political equality. That is to say that in the formal sense, we're equal qua citizen. And that critical perspective that you're naming undercuts that very foundational assumption, not only in our political life, but it makes us, it assumes that even in a face-to-face conversation, we can't be treated as equals, which is exactly what civility does. Cornel, I was wondering,
So,
Cornel, I was wondering if you had, and Teresa, I see you want to jump in.
No,
Go ahead, Teresa, and then I'll call Cornel.
You let Sister Teresa jump right on in.
Oh, no. Well, I was just going to say, I wanted to sort of vigorously disagree, but after Brother Cornel got his word.
Oh, no, we want to hear your disagreement. This is good. This is what Gegenstein. This is good opposition here. Go right ahead.
Well, I appreciate very much what Andrew has to say, but I do want to sort of disagree vigorously to your face on a bit of what you said. I think we need to be really careful to conflate to distinguish a couple things. Yet, I mean, of course, I'll say that, but the thing I think we need to distinguish here is that the kind of rise of a particular kind of standpoint epistemology that you're pointing to in elite discourses today, I think poses challenges for civility, absolutely. But the critique of civility, or the worry that civility is always part and parcel of a civilizing discourse, what we call in the business, about a way of silencing or excluding or marginalizing the already marginal. I mean, one of the things I would like to point out about civility is that suspicion of civility is just right. Civility is always part and parcel of a civilizing discourse. It has a status quo bias built in. It says, this is the way we do things in our civitas, in our society, and this is the standard of behavior we expect of our members. So I don't think that proponents of civility can dismiss that or neglect that or say it's not a problem. What I would just encourage us to do is then to be really kind of self-aware and say, yes, it's a civilizing discourse. Not all civilizing discourses are created equal. We actually then have to sort of have a debate about why we have the standards we do and why they're better than other ones. And just to, I want to seize on something just because it's very close to my heart and on my mind at the moment. I think we've got to be really careful and not assume that civility implies treating others as equals. I think that civility can be egalitarian and it can be a democratic norm, but it isn't necessarily. So I think we really need to be careful not to sort of assume that all good things go together or all the things we happen to like in this particular moment go together. They haven't historically, and they don't necessarily now. So anyway, so again, pedantry is the point, but I think it's helpful.
There's a lot I want to say, but I'm not on the panel, so I'm going to resist.
Jump right in.
I turn to Cornel West and say,
this is rich though. But I want to draw a distinction though between the larger context of spiritual decay and moral decrepitude that Brother Andrew's talking about, versus the way in which civility functions. Civility functions against a certain backdrop. You see, so that when de Tocqueville talked about civic associations, or Michael Oakeshott, or Sheldon Wolin on the left, they presuppose a certain backdrop of soulcraft. When the soulcraft itself undergoes massive corrosion, then civility itself is always going to be under profound suspicion, because it looks like, at least it's manipulative. It looks like it's disguising power. It looks like it's hypocrisy in that sense. And see, we're experiencing a moment of such deep spiritual decay and moral decrepitude that those ad hominem attacks that come at you will come at all of us, you know what I mean, across ideological lines, racial lines, sexual lines, regional lines, and so forth, is something that, you know, in our lived experience is very painful. But I think it's important to keep a distinction between the larger background conditions and then the way civility operates. You need strong, healthy, spiritually, morally intact background conditions for civility to really work. If everybody's going in with massive distrust and contempt, then you're not going to get any civility. It's all going to be disguised. Even the counter disguise will be a disguise. And you're not going to get no Louis Armstrong. You're not going to get integrity, honesty, spreading joy, bearing witness to love. And you see it's going to be alien. One last point that I want to accent the Freudian slip of Brother David talking about humility, because it seems to me the rich Socratic legacy of Athens, as profound as it is, you're not going to get humility there. The legacy of Jerusalem, you're going to get humility. Now, in the secular form, you're going to get fallibility, where you get the John Stuart Mill and so forth, but you're not going to get humility. The Christian leaven in the larger societal loaf has something to do with humility. that's part of the distinctive original contribution of Hebrew scripture, Palestinian Jew named Jesus, Christian developments, and all of its various streams and strands. So I don't want that humility to drop out. I think the Spirit was working with you, though, brother. I think that the interplay between humility and civility, and fallibility and civility is very, very important.
Before we leave this topic, I did like what Andrew said, and I do think that under civility there is a kind of some degree of equality, even if it's not always democratic egalitarianism in the sense that you're resisting, Teresa. And I take this that if we think, for example, what Martin Luther King does in the civil rights movement, on one understanding of civility, it doesn't look civil because it's insistent and it's demanding change. But on the other hand, what it's demanding is equality.
It's demanding a right to be there, a right to be there, to be weighed in the balance, to count, right? And I absolutely agree with that. When we're talking about civility, it's always about who is a member of our society, who, if we're all in the same boat, what's the boat and who's in the boat, right? But I think civility, unlike a lot of the other virtues or ideals that inform our political discourse, is fundamentally, and here's a good Oakeshottian point, fundamentally partial and particular. It exists in particular communities. It exists among particular people. And so it's not when people try, you know, a lot of my book is just kind of getting frustrated with people who want to assume that civility and respect are the same thing. Civility is the virtue we need precisely when respect breaks down. Mm-hmm. And so again, I don't, maybe I'm just a little bit allergic to the way that civility can kind of enter into sort of slightly like bromide territory. If we could all be more civil, then we would all be on the same team and supporting the same things and the ideals and what our society should look like, or what ideals define us. But whenever we're talking about civility, it's an indication that we don't agree about that. We don't agree who we are. We don't agree what ideals define us. And so that I think we can lose.
So let me ask if civility has limits. Andrew, let me put this to you too. Does civility have limits? And here I don't mean civility as niceness. I mean civility, the hard civility that Teresa is talking about, where we maybe are voicing disagreements face to face. And when I say does it have limits, I'm on normative terrain here. I mean, should it have limits? Ought it to have limits is what I mean, Andrew.
It's a very good question. Can I just reflect a little bit on what Cornel and Teresa have just said? And one is that civility is an inherited cultural practice too. That's the Oakeshottian point. It, as we understand it, it has not emerged, for example, in Russia to a great extent in the political culture. It does not exist in many other societies where it doesn't exist in Saudi Arabia. It doesn't exist in all sorts of places where the pull of tribe, of faction, of aristocracy, of tyranny weighs on the entire society. And what civility is, in fact, is something that has been uniquely created by the modern European state, by which I mean post-16th century, really. David just got the Oakeshottian reference. But anyway, the second thing that really interests me is at the core of the civility, the deep Christian understanding that we are neither male nor female, Greek nor Jew, but all one in Jesus, this radical Christian notion that we are all fundamentally equal in the eyes of God, in the eyes of human dignity. And I do not, and I think that's what we're asked to see in the face of our profound opponent, who may be culturally and racially or in any other way very different from us. We can see as Christians that this is a person with a soul as worthy as any other soul on earth. And that is deeply rooted within the Christian tradition and within the political tradition of some Western countries, including the United States. Now, if you take that away, if you remove a core cultural consensus about the existence of souls and their fundamental equality and the mandate to treat everybody the same, regardless of these other things, then how are we going to get civility back? And I do not think it's a complete accident that, for example, the 21st century, which has seen a terrible decline in civil discourse, has also seen a huge decline in those committed to Christianity. And indeed, many people within that framework of Christianity abandoning it altogether for power, as on the religious or Christianist right. So my concern is that maybe Christianity is more important in our political system than we have fully understood, and that leaving it behind will remove some basic, fundamental, psychological, spiritual orientation toward politics that makes liberal democracy possible. And I fear that many other cultures in the world have never understood this or believed it. And the kind of egalitarian notion of civility is so deeply rested in Christian thought that I wonder if it can survive the collapse of Christianity.
Can I respond and sort of amplify something that you've just said, Andrew? I think that you're right to point to early modernity as the kind of crucial historical site of this sort of civility in our sense, where it emerges and where it really begins to take shape. And I would point not to Christianity generally, but I would point specifically to a kind of Calvinism, and particularly these arguments that come out in the after the Reformation, particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries, that are really trying to work out how to distinguish the two standards of membership or behavior in two different kinds of communities. So civility is the standard of membership in the civil society, and spirituality as the standard of membership in the church. And so civility and spirituality come apart in this period, and intolerant societies, or sort of would-be tolerant societies, are trying to work out systematically what these two standards are. And so while I'm very sort of sympathetic to a lot of what you and Brother Cornel have been saying, I do really worry, as someone who's, among other things, an intellectual historian, that we run this risk of conflating the standard of civility, which is essential for our tolerant society to stand, with the standard of spirituality or true religion. So I think we've got to keep civility and Christianity, although these are kind of mutually constitutive ideals, we've got to keep them apart as separate ideals.
I don't disagree. I don't. I'm just concerned. I'm just interested in whether underneath the surface, culturally, that in fact this is an ingredient which is absolutely essential to the fostering of the kind of understanding of individual equality that makes liberal democracy possible. And whether you can take the metaphysics out of this and still survive is a genuine question that America, for example, has not had to face yet, but it's going to have to face, and which Western European countries have faced rather boldly.
But you know, I wonder though, Brother Andrew, whether we as a democratic experiment, as fragile as it's always been, have already faced it. I mean, you're saying on the one hand, well, this notion of imago Dei and being made in the image and likeness of God cuts so deep that there's a spiritual egalitarian sensibility vis-a-vis whatever other equalities. It could be social equality, economic equality, but there's something about the self that's not reducible to just a social category and a political category. Now, see, I think that's one of the great contributions. That's not just Christianity, though. That's our Jewish brothers and sisters. That's Hebrew scripture. With that, I'm not going to get it, right? I mean, so the two are deeply tied in that way. We got a particular Palestinian Jew named Jesus. We follow through, but there's Hillel and Baal Shem Tov and others that also tied to this. But in addition, though, when you look at the Civil War in the United States, I mean, if that's not the breakdown of civility, I don't know what is. You see, so that we could have all the spiritual egalitarian activity going on a deep level, and we're still at each other's throats, brothers killing brothers, fellow citizens murdering fellow citizens, and so forth. So we have this example of massive breakdown of civility. And this is internal to the United States. We haven't got the guns of August yet, where the breakdown of civility goes transcontinental and international and so forth. So what do you say about that, Brother Andrew and Sister Teresa?
Well, I would say that, in fact, it was rooted, well, yes, Christianity is a very broad church and has many different influences and has been corrupted and perverted in many ways. And the way, for example, in which the Confederacy attempted to co-opt Christianity for slavery is obviously abhorrent. The question becomes, have we begun to see our fellow citizens as somehow so outside the realm of reason, or see them through this racial lens, which otherizes them to such an extent? I mean, that in fact, the Christians who believe that African Americans could be slaves or even deserve to be slaves, that's not Christianity, it cannot be Christianity. And so it was a failure of Christianity that brought that about, and a distortion and corruption of it. Now that can still exist, and it does exist. Right. I mean, talking about the way in which certain elements of the political right have fused with an otherwise honorable evangelical tradition and perverted it and corrupted it in such a way that it ceases, I think, to be a genuine religion at all. Obviously, this can be perverted and corrupted, but that doesn't mean we can't reach back to it. That doesn't mean that, in fact, the pure equality of human beings is such a fundamental principle in our Constitution, in our Declaration, that, and it's rooted in some sense, and it can be transmuted into a secular form, and often is. I mean, people who aren't Christians at all can actually uphold the notion of absolute individual equality and individual dignity and worth. But without it, without our culture supporting it, when our culture constantly emphasizes difference, substantive difference, racially, sexually, all this, and pits people against each other, and there is no leavening, there is no sense that, yes, despite these differences, and they are real, and we have to account for them, and we do understand they've affected us, but they're not the end, and they're not the only thing, and we can transcend that. And I just don't know how you revive that tradition in an era where Christian discourse has been so corrupted and is so weak. And that's my worry. It's my profound worry about this, that we don't see each other as individuals. We see each other as avatars of a race or an identity or something threatening to us. As opposed to another human. And I do think we have to come back to the internet, really, as a key element that's made this much worse. Because I don't know, when I used to write emails to people, it was always fun, but put me on an email list in a condo association, I become a monster. And people flame on emails. They did from the very get-go. Now take away, adopt anonymity, and you have obviously a massive incentive for the worst aspects of human nature to rise up and to demonize and otherize and obliterate. You see all those debates you sometimes see on YouTube, and the title is "So-and-so destroys so-and-so."
Yeah.
That's not what a debate is about.
Exactly.
The analogy, the Ocean analogy, is that it's different. There's a difference between playing a professional tennis match where you've got to win everything, and a friendly tennis match where the goal is just to keep the thing going over the net. You're a little bit over the line, whatever. We're enjoying this. We're having a good time here, and we're learning a little bit.
So I'm gonna enjoy disagreeing with a couple of things you just said, Andrew, but also to sort of underscore the point. I think that I'm sure this conversation will come around to the internet and specifically what the internet has done. But I really, really worry and want to push back against this idea. Well, two things: that there's something exclusively Christian about civility in our sense. I don't think that's right. I think there's a contingent historical development that led to this kind of conceptual distinction between civility and spirituality, but that you see absolutely, norms of civility and cultures of civility arising in Islamic traditions, in Hindu traditions, and all sorts of other traditions. So I want us to sort of, resist the kind of Christian exceptionalism there. And I also want to it's something that I'm thinking a lot about a lot at the moment, and actually writing a book on, is precisely this idea of equality that both you and Brother Cornel have been pointing to, and sort of what is the relevant ideal. I think the relevant ideal that certainly is strong in the Christian tradition, not only not only in adapting Jewish traditions of Imago Dei, but also the idea in Corinthians where all are one in Christ. That is an ideal of equality as indifference. It says that although we have all these superficial differences, they are fundamentally matters of indifference when it comes to God's perspective, or in Roman law, the perspective of natural law. That's a different kind of equality than the other kind of equality you two have been invoking, which is this idea of equality as relating to one another as equals of equal dignity and worth. Those are different ideas, they're different traditions. I would argue that in the American Declaration, we get the former, equality as indifference, sprinkled with a little bit of the latter, which I would describe as equality as parity, this kind of comparability of value. And we've got to be, I think we need to give critics of civility enough credit when they point out that historically the idea that equality as indifference has been perfectly consistent, not only with the institution of slavery, but also with institutions of patriarchy and the inferiority of women, and not to sort of write those out of the tradition. I think they're really also important. And they've been fundamental to codes of civility. To give you an historical example, in early modernity, which is obviously the period I study, the civil gesture of acknowledging someone in the street was for men to take off their hat. For a woman, it was to keep her head covered, right? These are different norms. They reflect different social positions. Nevertheless, they're codes of civility. It would have been uncivil not to abide by those. So again, I don't want us to import this kind of romantic notion of democratic equality into what we're talking about when we're asking people to sort of, respect a kind of status quo bias in their interactions. It's not to say that those existing sort of the status quo is necessarily just. Nevertheless, civility is essential if we're going to make the status quo more just together.
But I think part of the challenge, though, Brother Andrew, and you tell me whether I misunderstand you, is that in a moment in which there's such massive breakdown of civility in our day, what are the resources available, spiritual and intellectual, that would allow us to get beyond viewing each other just as social constructs, rather than persons who have a sanctity in the eyes of God, or dignity? We got our Stoics, they've got wonderful conceptions of human natural rights in that sense, but it's dignity talk, it's not sanctity talk, but still it's moving in that same direction. But it's the natural rights tradition that does provide some resources. Martin Luther King lays that out in the letter of Birmingham jail, right? That's part of a natural rights, natural law tradition. Once the erosion of that kind of spiritual egalitarian orientation is lost, then all we have are just social constructs and labels. And if all you have are social constructs and labels, how will you ever get to the deeper human connection? Even though the practices over time have always been, just radically inadequate. That's part of the juxtaposition of how they become so easily adaptive to structures of domination that you talk about, white supremacy, male supremacy, the way capitalists treat bosses too often treat their workers. So Karl Marx has something to say about this, and so on. Or the way, imperial subjects treat their colonized subjects, and so forth and so on. With the Irish tradition, Brother Andrew tell you about that. That's 800 years, right? The Brits mistreating our precious Irish brothers and sisters. But what happens when those resources become less and less potent? Now, is that a fair interpretation, my brother?
Yeah, it is. That's pretty fair. Yeah.
Let me jump in. Let me jump in. Cornel West he's a great moderator. He's asking all the questions I wanted to ask. But let me just, we're coming up to, we have about 15 minutes before we should go to Q&A, and I would just like to take stock of where we are. I mean, I've been listening. One of the questions I've had in the back of my mind is what does erode civility? And we've got about 4 different answers from various folks here. I mean, the waning of Christian belief is one. The rise of critical theory is one that Andrew proposed. The fading away and challenge of the human rights, natural rights tradition is another. And we talked a little bit about modern social media and the internet. Since we don't have too much time, maybe we could leave the question of what erodes at that kind of a list there and turn our attention to what might be able to to recover or start to retrieve, if possible. And it might be that it's not possible. I mean, not everything has a solution. And if Andrew's right about the way in which this comes to us through tradition, these things cannot be easily recreated. But I would stress that civility on all of our account happens to be a virtue, and that virtues can be practiced, in fact, have to be practiced to become what they are. And so are there certain practices individually and maybe even at the aggregate or social level that you might point to that might help us recover our civility?
Let me make one. The university, the whole concept of a liberal education is precisely to foster this virtue of free range of ideas in combat, in conflict, but with civility. And that practicing that is an incredibly good spiritual as well as civic lesson. When I think of when Dr. West goes out there with Robbie George and they go at it. And they couldn't be, they're very different in many ways, although, you know, they both share a certain Christian perspective. That is what it is about. We need to demonstrate that and show how fun it is, how rewarding it is, and how it is possible just by the example of someone like Brother Cornel and I don't know, we've all adopted this vernacular now, and Brother Robbie. It's catching. And, you know, I'll tell you this. I spent 25 years making a case for something that was really quite radical at the time, equality in marriage for gay people. And the practice that I took specifically was to turn down no invitation to go anywhere, to go to fundamentalist churches, to go to radical left-wing liberationist meetings, to have a conversation. When I published an anthology about it, I included the best arguments I could find for the other side. And we did this debate over 20 so years, and people changed their minds. And not only that, but when you do it in that process, it doesn't happen overnight. It happens through dialogue, through sharing your experiences, through being open to converse with anyone. And in fact, it's most important to converse with people who are most likely to disagree with you. Also, by the way, the most fun and enjoyable, even though it may not be the most gratifying, because you may end up being a little bruised at the end of it, but that's the point. And my other point is we won. We got what we were hoping to get. And not only that, but because we chose this method of civility and discourse, it's stuck and it's not going to be reversed. And my concern is that that liberal civil tradition is, for example, if you think of the very difficult question of trans people in the current discourse, just not being followed at all, which means you have one swing one way, another backlash another way. You have no emerging consensus. You have deeper bitterness. You have sense of paranoia on both sides. And in fact, both sides are beleaguered. There are reasons they both feel beleaguered. But civility and liberalism is the only way out of it. I truly believe that. And I do believe, because I've lived it, that it can be incredibly effective.
Cornel, could you think about the acts of recovery, practices, individual and social, out loud with us?
You know, I'm thinking of that wonderful line in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason: examples are the go-kart of judgment. If we're going to reconstitute soulcraft in such a way that the basic virtues that people have access to are enacted such that others are convinced or find it contagious or themselves are looking for alternatives to the decadence, then you have the possibility of a spiritual and moral renaissance. And that's the only way, that's what we human beings, that's the best that we do. We just have ways of awakening. And awakenings come from exemplars. And exemplars are rooted in courage. They're rooted in people who are willing to do things that take a risk, that radically unsettle others. Just a quick digression, though, with my dear brother Andrew talking about the Russians. that one of the reasons why the Russians have the greatest novelistic tradition in the modern world, which is dialogical to the core. We didn't need Bakhtin to tell us that. Why? It's precisely because of the level of repression, the level of regimentation, the inability to create a civic space in the Russian Empire. It had to go underground in the artists. So the question of vocation, the way Max Weber talked about in the two great essays, become fundamental if we're going to have the right kind of exemplars to serve as catalysts for the spiritual and moral renaissance that allows us to disagree in such a way that we still try to keep track of each other's humanity, even though we're going at it tooth and nail. I mean, you know, me and Andrew could fight over war of Iraq back and forth. And then he says, well,
no, I changed my mind, Cornel.
I know, I've been following. I changed my mind. I said, oh, that my brother Andrew, he's part of the Pythos. He's part of the persuasion. He's part of the civic discourse. And I've changed my mind. That's what it's all about. No, I'm trying to go on so long.
So we need to be also as exemplars. We need to explain when we've changed our minds.
Oh, absolutely. No, but exemplars mean giving an account for why. But that's where humility comes in. That's where fallibility comes in. That's where acknowledgement of the degree to which we're all walking contradictions and disasters, also sources of wonder. And
that's why, for example, and this is another way you can try and exemplify this and practice it, is that, so for example, every week I put out the weekly dish, which is my column. Afterwards, I always put dissents of the week.
That's good.
And they take me to task. Sometimes I ought to argue back. Sometimes I'm like, that's a fair point. I hadn't properly considered. Now, I'm not preening in my own moral virtue here. I really think people will understand the thing better. And once people realize you're not in it entirely to win this point, but to advance the civil project along.
Exactly.
I think that's absolutely right.
Then people actually do respond to it. I don't think people like this form of media, which is one side is just kind of propaganda and the other side is kind of propaganda. You never see two people having a debate on CNN or Fox or MSNBC. They're always agreeing and they're always attacking these invisible people out there that they don't want to talk to.
The mysterious they who've got it all wrong.
Right. Or the left or the right or these other abstractions. You turn them into an actual human being and have them sit next to you and talk to you. That helps.
Yeah. Can I jump in on this? So I agree 100% with what my esteemed colleagues have just said. And I would also say that I, in my own career, have regarded both of these men as exemplars. And I think that I really admire them and what they do. And I just want to maybe push 2 points, which I think maybe are distinctive to my perspective. I mean, one is I don't find disagreement and I don't find controversy easy. I don't enjoy it. And I think that there are basic dispositional differences between individuals. One of the things I really like about Thomas Hobbes in his 1642 work, De Cive, he just points out that there's a reason disagreeable is a synonym for unpleasant, because disagreeing with someone is implicitly accusing them of reasoning incorrectly. And if you disagree with them on a number of points, you're basically calling them a fool, right? So there's an element of insult intrinsic to disagreement. And I think that we can't forget that, we can't neglect that. We've got to take that seriously. By the same token, there's a reason agreeable is a synonym for pleasant. And so the role of homophily, that is the like of the similar, the wanting to kind of have a group of agreeable, like-minded individuals, must always be resisted. And I think it must especially be resisted in the academy. And I really do weep for the academy because homophily is a hell of a drug and it's extremely strong in the academy. But I would just say, for my own part, as a university professor in in elite and prestigious institutions through which so many future leaders of the UK and other countries pass, I really do see it as my duty to model what I would call near civility for my students, to model the importance of engaging with controversy, the importance of engaging with disagreement, the importance of changing one's mind. And the way that Andrew described his efforts with gay marriage is just so beautiful, because Andrew was an evangelist. He made himself an evangelist. And the point of the evangelist is not to just talk to the people who agree with him already. It's to change minds, and it's to make the world more just. And so I think for our civil society to survive, we need evangelists. And I myself am not one. Maybe I'm an evangelist for mere civility, but certainly I'm an evangelist for, there's a crisis of something in our universities, but I would describe it as a crisis of epistemic humility.
Yeah, yep.
David, that's the crisis. Epistemic humility is not regarded as a virtue any longer in university spaces. Instead, it's about recognizing certain knowers as authoritative, as opposed to understanding all of ourselves as radically partial and imperfect as knowers. And so that's where I would really think that a lot of work needs to be done.
We've got a couple really good questions, and the first one is coming to you, Dr. West. Dr. West, God bless you, my brother. I believe this past year has seen some of the most race-based polarization in the history of our young nation. Do you believe the Christian church can provide a common ground from which to build a stronger, more civil and harmonious society?
Oh, I believe the prophetic Christian practice is always a leaven in a loaf. And I'd bake my life on it, and I'm willing to die for it. But at the same time, I think it's very important to keep in mind that when we talk about polarization, talk about gangsterization, we have to keep different levels and registers and dimensions in place. When it comes to the younger generation, the largest massive demonstrations in the history of the American democratic experiment took place this summer. And it was chocolate, vanilla, it was multiracial across the board. Now that's unprecedented, even when we were with Martin in the 60s and so forth. You know, the March on Washington was multiracial, but not in scope and depth of what we saw. So when we talk about racial polarization, it's among elite discourse, it's among the chattering classes, it's among the professional managerial classes in the universities of elite orientation and so forth, right? And it's on the ground as well. But the younger generation does have a yearning and enactment of multiracial sensibility that is unprecedented in the history of the country. It's not as if there has been progress against white supremacy. It's that it's so difficult to come to terms with new forms of it. And people have a push buttons mentality. They got overnight panacea. If they don't see it, a major breakthrough, they figure, oh my God, we got an impasse. Oh my God, I can't trust anybody. Oh my God, we're making no. They got to read some Chekhov. They've got to realize this is a battle that's prolonged, that is sustained. You have to have a consistency of what Jane Austen called a constancy. This is not a kind of overnight kind of thing. And so on the one hand, the polarization is deep, but on the other hand, good God Almighty, if the only folk who could vote in America were under 39, there'd be a Jewish president in the White House who I would be with in a second, called Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is unprecedented in American politics.
But let me make a point about this younger generation, however.
Yes.
They really don't like dissent.
That's right.
They really don't like someone.
Well, I think they distrust.
And they're prepared to punish people. Look, you've heard what I've said and my values and everything. Yeah. They would not tolerate me existing at the same magazine. Even if I were living somewhere else, I don't interact. The people are being purged all over the place, in institutions, in magazines, in newspapers, in the culture, because they don't adhere to the almost monolithic view of a younger generation. That is not civility. That is the exercise of power to shape opinion. Now, I'm a lucky man. I've gone independent. I can reach as many people, but a lot of others can't.
No, that's true. That's true. No, that's important.
Intimidated about speaking their mind in colleges. You see the polling showing people are very afraid to speak their mind. This is incredibly unhealthy.
But you would agree, though, Brother Andrew, that the younger generation is less racially polarized. I mean, the younger generation's got some real problems and challenges, and we hit head on. They need a much more deeper spiritual sense of fallibility and humility and openness to others, and cultivating a faculty of receptivity so they can learn from others. but they are less racially polarized. You see?
Yes, and I find that really encouraging.
And that's a beautiful thing. Same is true in terms of embrace of our precious gays and lesbians and non-binary.
That's absolutely right. But I would point to
I would just say that if they're more comfortable, and this is much better because they've grown up in a much more racially diverse society. But if we gain racial diversity and acceptance at the expense of intellectual diversity,
right, I agree.
We're trading one bad thing for the other.
May I interject?
Absolutely.
As a millennial, the only millennial on this panel, I think.
And it's very millennial to start by saying as a.
Exactly.
She knows that.
Foreground
authority here.
My identity. So I agree with much of what's been said. I would just point to just the thing that David flagged earlier is that also this is a generation that has come of age in an era of parasociability, by which I mean they have come of age on the internet, and the internet is a form of parasociality where you feel as though you're engaging with other people, and more people than you ever had in your whole life or was ever possible for earlier generations, but you're not actually engaging with them. You're engaging with a kind of appearance of difference, an appearance of the other. And that's what leads to the ease of demonization that Andrew was talking about. It also leads to a kind of artificial acceptance. Difference is very easy to embrace and celebrate when it's encountered at a distance, right? And so I would say that the kind of the phenomenon of people living in extremely homogenous communities and increasingly segregating geographically on the basis of ideology hasn't gone away. It's getting worse. And that is just, that's really sort of scary. And so we have these two things happening. At the one hand, we're sort of more engaged, more accepting than ever, but in practice, engaging with fewer and fewer people who actually disagree with us or even look that different than us, to be honest.
Let me add up one.
That's a powerful point. That's a powerful point, though.
And it's not just us. The algorithms are designed to do that.
Absolutely.
It's part of the entire, the profitability of this is linked to the rousing of these passions that never encounter reason. Yep. And so we have a structural incentive for hatred, essentially.
It's the agreeableness algorithm.
And for anti-reason and for emotions to overwhelm our ability, and certainly against humility.
Sorry. I want to push back against this Enlightenment demonization of emotion, Andrew. I think that the passions are important here, and I think I'm with Hume. But I agree with you that there is this kind of reaction against reason in the current culture, which is really worrying and sort of really misleading as to what kind of reason does, and the idea that actually reason does emancipate. But reason must also be critical about the exercise of reason itself.
Friends, let me bring in another questioner who wants to blame this to some extent on our political philosophy, and it presupposes a little bit of Rawls, but I think we can just think our way through it nonetheless. Do you think that the move over the past 10 to 15 years from political liberalism to a hegemonic liberalism may be evidence that political liberalism, I guess that's a thin liberalism, was not up to the task in providing meaning and purpose to citizens that in the past they acquired through church, civic organizations. In other words, what we've seen happening during the past decade is a kind of perfect storm. The thinness of political liberalism combined with the incessant debunking of traditional institutions is why you see people gravitate to alt-right, nationalist, or critical race theory perspectives. It's a kind of a standard account, actually, isn't it, that our liberalism thins out our intermediary organizations and thereby leaves us meaningless and susceptible to ideological groupings.
I think any discourse that is obsessed with justice, Niebuhr used to say any justice that's the only justice soon degenerates into something less than justice. You've got to have something deeper than justice in order to have a viable structure of feeling and meaning in your life to make it from womb to tomb. Yeah. So it's not just a new market-driven liberalism, the neoliberalism. It's liberalism as an ideology. It was very rich. It was very important. It pushed out the kings, the monarchs, and so forth. It provided strong justification for individual rights and what have you. But the limitations were always already built in because the deeper existential issues, you can look at John Stuart Mill's breakdown. You can go on and on and on. And we don't want to psychologize John Stuart right in public like this. But
he's dead. Go ahead.
No, we love he and Harriet. We love very much. But the point is that these richer traditions that provided structures of meaning and value are always more multidimensional than any liberal discourse. So even my dear brother and teacher and former department head, advisor John Rawls, who I love deeply, that he recognized that as well. So he knew he didn't want to fetishize justice. He just tried to make this tradition, this contractual tradition, one that could be a force for good. But we're on the other side of that now because so much of that liberalism has been complicitous with some of the, the racism, the sexism, the imperialism, and so forth that becomes more and more apparent.
I would just say liberalism isn't uniquely imbricated with racism, sexism, and all the rest.
Oh no, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
I don't think
we could talk about Marxism, communism, socialism. There's a whole lot of isms out there that are ideologically promiscuous. It will lie down with a whole lot of structures of domination. Oh, absolutely. But that's true for Christianity too.
Absolutely.
But strictly speaking, I don't see how it's inherently incompatible. I mean, you can, when you enter into politics, take on a role, a civic role. It's not all of you.
That's right. That's
you as a citizen, and there is nothing preventing people in such a system of finding meaning in a whole range of collective and communal activities, religious, artistic, all sorts of spiritual. We do see that happen. It's a human need. It's just that our resources in the spiritual sphere have narrowed with the collapse of enchantment and the collapse of religion as a really vibrant source of meaning for people. And I think Brother Cornel really understands that. And so in many ways, this is also a really religious challenge, which is how do we bring the truths of I don't mind saying this with Cornel, our gospels, show the liberating power of them in a way that does not seem bound up with completely anachronistic fairy tales. Now, I think it's possible, absolutely. And I think Christians have been trying to do it, but I think they've lost their way. But I'm not, I understand the critique of thin liberalism, obviously.
Right.
But I'm very leery of abandoning it.
Yeah.
I agree. Rawls and Oakeshott would sort of be, the later Rawls came quite close to Oakeshott, actually, I would say, in terms of his limitation of the limits of what liberalism can and should do.
That's right.
I would just say also,
but this is a task for the spiritual, for the people, the artists, for the writers, for us to create meaning that does not have to be expressed in politics, because for God's sake, we can't conduct politics at this existential level. It has to become a civil war.
That's brilliant. Yeah, Teresa, will you run home with that?
Yeah, no. So just again, I mean, Andrew's preaching to the converted on this, but I to the questioner, I would just say, well, liberalism is a very various phenomenon, and I would be very loath to surrender liberalism as the rich and varied tradition that it is to simply, various periods in the career of John Rawls, whom I greatly admire. But again, I just need to be a little careful about that. But yeah, I think that precisely what we see for this, for in the current moment, is that people in search of meaning increasingly find that meaning in something called politics. And it's the drive to then politicize everything. And again, the personal is political was a very powerful and important slogan at a particular point, but there's also a sense in which a lot of human life is not political, or that the idea that, or rather, this is how I would put it, the political does not exhaust the meaningful. by any stretch of the imagination. And what you see across the academic disciplines increasingly, I'm a political theorist, right? So I, made the mistake of actually going and becoming somewhat of an expert in thinking about politics in the abstract. What I find in other sort of social science and in especially humanistic disciplines is that politics and the political is used as a shorthand for significance in so much scholarship. To say that what you work on is significant is because you're going to show the political whatever of, some of shitty spy novels written in the 1960s. I mean, it's just the idea that that's the only interesting thing to say, or the only important thing to say about anything, is its political significance. It's just so boring and so reductive, and I just think it's absolutely. And this is coming from someone who actually studies and teaches politics for a living.
I'm with you 100%.
This is where the genius of Hebrew scripture, we thank our precious Jewish brothers and sisters for unleashing this in the world, which is this anti-idolatrous energy. So we can keep track of different dimensions, the political dimensions of X, the political dimensions of Y. Of course, if you deny it, then you live in a state of denial. But it is a dimension, and you don't want to end up worshiping it. You don't want to end up fetishizing it. And once Christians, then when Jesus says, oh, I'll give you some anti-idolatry, all right. Follow me into the temple. I'm going to walk right by those 400 Roman troops. I'm going to go at those bankers. I'm going to go at those intellectuals who rationalize those bankers. Then he turns around and what happened to my partners? Not a lot of courage, Peter. Not a lot of courage. Oh, all of a sudden they hardly even know him. Now, as long as we can tell that story with a power and a passion and a humility, that's going to touch the souls of people because it's the truth. It's the truth. I don't care who you are. Follow that story, that Palestinian Jew. And it's not dogmatic. No, Chesterton has taught us this ain't about no dogma and doctrine. This is about a way of being in the world. Very much what Oakeshott said about conservatism. Not a creed. It's not a doctrine. It's a disposition. It's a mode of existence. It's a way of being in the world.
Excellent essay.
And don't anybody speak. We have to leave it right there. That's where we're going to leave this conversation. It's the right spot. This has been really fun. I want to thank you three for your energy and your insights. You are all three welcome at Baylor anytime. We would love to see you. But this has been a terrific panel. I want to again thank our co-sponsor, the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. God bless you three. Thank you for sharing your thoughts about civility. This will wrap up our panel.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you very much.
Dave, Brother Andrew.
Lovely to see you guys. Yeah, great.
It's a blessing to be with you.
Absolutely awesome. Bye.